Welcome to WizeUp. I'm Paul Arthur. Want to talk today about John Diefenbaker. Yeah. And before we dive in, just a quick reminder to hit subscribe if you enjoy our show. Tell your friends about us as well. So, Canada's 13th Prime Minister. Little eccentric, well liked by a lot of folks. He seemed to be able to identify with you and me, the regular Joe Blows, right? Susie Q's, that sort of thing. So today's guest has written a book about him, Bob Plamondon. He's a public policy expert, an economist, and a consultant, also a best-selling author. And his latest is Freedom Fighter, John Diefenbaker's Battle for Canadian Liberties and Independence. And that book is available anywhere you shop for books, Amazon, of course. You can also check out Bob's website, bobplamondon.com. So, Bob, thanks for making time for us today.
My pleasure, Paul.
Yeah, looking forward to the conversation. John, wow. Again, I would hear my dad talk about John Diefenbaker. Can you share a little bit about his background, where he's from, how he was raised, that sort of thing?
So he was born in small town Ontario, Neustadt, and his family moved to Saskatchewan when he was about 8 years old. Again, living in rural Saskatchewan. I would say growing up in poverty, so he knew what it was like to be cold in the winter and to worry about food, and so it was not there was no affluence growing up, and he had the Germanic surname, so he felt a bit out of touch with those who traditionally had power in Canada and who made laws in Canada, those of British and French origin. So that kind of from his youth set in his mind the importance of having a Canada free of discrimination, because he felt that. In fact, his family name was Diefenbaker, and they changed it to Diefenbaker to sound a little bit less Germanic. Growing up, he was a good student, but not a great student, but always had an interest in history and in politics and in the monarchy, and ultimately in law. So coming through his university studies, he did study to practice law. In fact, even during his high school years, he would go into the courtroom and watch the great performers. So there was a natural attraction, but it was always in his case sticking up for the underdog. The one who was on the wrong side of the law, maybe not for the right reasons, but who was persecuted. So he always identified with them. He did sign up in the First World War, was discharged for health reasons. So he had an injury he incurred while training, finished off his law degree, and then started to practice law in small town Saskatchewan. He wanted to be in the courtroom right away. So he thought, I'll go to a small town, have my own firm, and I'll get courtroom time. And he developed a reputation for someone who would take on cases that others would not. And even those who were charged with capital crimes, and deservedly gained a reputation for winning cases that others might not have. He had charisma, a flair for the dramatic. He was just a terrific courtroom performer. And, because of that, and his affiliation with the underdog, that brought him into politics, where he thought this was a place where he could advocate for justice. But it wasn't, Paul, a good start. He ran in 5 federal and provincial elections and went 0 for 5.
That's incredible. Talk about stick-to-itiveness, right?
Well, the only reason why someone would do that is if they felt that they had a purpose, they had a vision, and they had a destiny. And all 3 you could use to describe John Diefenbaker. But he did win election in 1940 federally as the progressive conservative at the outset of the First World War. And because of his slow start that didn't diminish his ambition, when the leadership of the party came up, he put his hand up and ran for leader. In fact, he ran on 2 occasions and essentially got blown out. Not considered serious, but all the while he was traveling the country and advocating for the Canada that he thought, which was, one that was built on the foundations of the British tradition, talking about civil rights, talking about the underdog, helping farmers, helping people who were poor. So he did it with style. So he developed a following of sorts, but only at the grassroots, not at the decision makers, the power brokers, Bay Street, the Albany Club, or even his fellow MPs. But ultimately, on his third try for leadership of the party in 1956, he won. And the power brokers at the time thought, well, he's going to, there's no use trying to stop him because the people want him. That they thought of as a bit of derision. Well, the people want him. We don't, but the people want him. So they said, let the crazy son of a bitch have it. He'll win. We'll lose the next election and we'll get back to normal. Well, lo and behold, he wins the leadership in 56. And he's supposed to get creamed by Louis Saint Laurent in 1957. But lo and behold, he wins a minority government. Wow. This is leading a party that of the previous 9 elections had won only once.
Wow.
So it was quite an accomplishment. So I'm bringing you up to the point where he becomes Prime Minister of Canada.
Yeah, and so I think he won a couple of minorities and then a huge majority, right? And you say, he's a populist. Well, people understand absolutely went crazy about him. I mean, it's hard to believe that, what actually happened. I'm hearing about, when he's walking down the streets, people are just like absolutely mobbing him. He's like, a rock star.
So so 57, he unexpectedly wins a minority. Lester Pearson, a guy with an incredible CV, had just won the Nobel Peace Prize. Highly credentialed, become leader of the Liberal Party. And the Liberal Party thought, the Conservatives were like, mumps, something you get once in your life. So they Pearson comes into the House of Commons and says that John Diefenbaker should resign and let him take over. Well, Diefenbaker would have none of it. He thought this was a sign of a weak party and a weak leader. So after, less than a year in power, Diefenbaker calls another election. And that is the election where he won the largest majority in Canadian history on a proportionate basis. No one's come close to it. So as you describe, he captured the imagination of the nation. They thought, here's finally a leader who's on our side, who sticks up for us, who's trying to make life better for us. And when he was on the campaign trail, massive crowds, people just wanted to touch his coat. They were mesmerized by him, and he won. So this massive victory in 57, and that it helped that he had a breakthrough in Quebec. Then he won another minority in 1962, and then ultimately the Liberals won a minority in 1963. So he won 3 elections in a row from a party that had won 1 in the previous 9.
Okay, yeah, and he was like in, what was it, roughly 39, 40 years, something like that, as a member of Parliament? That's craziness. I mean, the guy had liked enduring punishment, I guess.
Well, that's one way of looking at it. So he gets elected in 1940. He becomes Prime Minister in 1957. He's defeated in 63, runs again as the leader in 65. Then Robert Stanfield becomes leader of the party in 67. So he sat effectively in the House of Commons as a member of Parliament without being leader of the party from 1967 until he died in 1979. Long enough to see Joe Clark elected as Prime Minister. So he was in the House of Commons then when the Tories finally came back, although he was not easy on his successors. He said that Canada celebrated the International Year of the Child by electing Joe Clark as Prime Minister.
Ouch, that's not going to win you a lot of friends, but...
Well, you'll get a few laughs anyway.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, he had quite the wit, actually, from what I'm reading in your book here. Now, maybe just, I wonder if we can just kind of transpose that onto today's political world. So, of course, Canadians very concerned over the last year here, election time especially, about Trump's tariffs and intrusions from the U.S., at least perceived. So you write that Diefenbaker himself was always wary of U.S. interference, and apparently there was quite a bit from from J.F. Kennedy. How do you think he'd respond to our current situation with the U.S.?
Yeah, let me just delve a little bit deeper into what it means for a Canadian prime minister to stick up to an American president that not only is intent on asserting themselves over Canadian sovereignty and soil, but also on the international stage. So when Diefenbaker became prime minister, one of his first acts was to divert 15% of our trade away from the United States and towards Commonwealth in other countries. He was trading with China. We were selling wheat to China. The Americans were trying to stop us from doing so. And he would say to the Americans, he said, if you persist, I'll go on national television and warn the Canadian people that an American president is trying to run our country, which they didn't want to do. After the Cuban Missile, the overthrow of by Castro, the revolution in Cuba, Canada continued to trade with the United States. The Americans weren't happy about it, but Diefenbaker's job, as he saw it, he wasn't trading any secrets or any military equipment, but it was to stick up strongly for Canadian sovereignty, which he did with his northern vision, developing our infrastructure and roads to resources so that we had the foundations for our economy. These are the sorts of things that we're thinking of doing, or we're planning to do today, that all political parties are talking about, is building up the resilience, fortifying the Canadian economy, making us less dependent on the Americans. This is something Diefenbaker was doing in 1957, and doing so, quite successfully. Although I would say at the time, when he did not want to accept American-controlled nuclear weapons on Canadian soil during the Cold War crisis, the Liberal government of Lester Pearson wanted that. And the Liberal government at Lester Pearson was being supported by John F. Kennedy and his administration, who were quite intent on defeating Diefenbaker, not without doubt the most profound foreign election interference in Canadian history coming out of the Americans. So Diefenbaker would have no hesitation today about making Canadian sovereignty his top priority.
Okay, he'd have none of the 51st state stuff. Okay. I understand that Diefenbaker was also not a fan of government overreach. He was against the War Measures Act. How do you think he'd respond to, the former Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's use of the Emergency Act with the trucker convoy?
Well, he was always wary of using the full force of the government on its people. And so he certainly, during the Second World War, he opposed the internment of Japanese Canadians, which was suspending their legal rights. We didn't have, the charter at the time, but we did have the War Measures Act, and he always warned that the War Measures Act could be used against the Canadian people in times other than war, and he advocated for its removal from the books. And in fact, the War Measures Act was replaced with the Emergencies Act. Brian Mulroney saw to that, so that there were limitations on how the military and national forces could be used against protesters, and there was checks and balances put on the system. And Diefenbaker, I think, would have agreed with that. I think Diefenbaker would have accepted that the Emergencies Act was a far better piece of legislation than the War Measures Act, and that it should be used sparingly. I don't know in the circumstance whether he would have said, yes, it should be invoked, but I can't imagine that he would have said that the truckers can stay on Wellington Street forever without being ticketed or towed away.
Right.
In the sense that they were obstructing, to a degree, the peaceful enjoyment of that space by ordinary Canadians. He was always, on the side of ordinary Canadians. So it's hard to say whether he would have invoked it, but he certainly would have been hesitant to use it.
Yeah, I'm guessing he wouldn't have used well, maybe I'm wrong, but used a comment like, the fringe minority, right? A bunch of wackos out there, right? And would he have actually met with them to, have a discussion? Hey, what are your concerns?
So he might have done that, but when the Newfoundland Premier Joey Smallwood demanded that the federal government intervene in a strike in Newfoundland, and because it had become violent, and they wanted the National Police for the RCMP to come in, Diefenbaker refused. He said, "I'm not going to use the National Police Force for strike breaking." So
Wow.
that was his. I mean, I think with every political leader, it's important to understand their inclinations and their instincts, because you never know what issues are going to come up and which way do they lean when confronted with difficult choices. And it's pretty clear which way Diefenbaker would lean it, which was not to use the heavy hand of government and to
Right.
relate as best he could with the struggles that ordinary Canadians were facing.
And again, it's probably really hard to, exactly nail down how he would have responded to the COVID-19 lockdowns. But again, yeah, any thoughts on that?
So, again, he didn't face similar circumstances. Um, and I think there was a lack of knowledge about what was going to happen next during COVID, and how, as it turns out, we can look back on it now and think about all of the things that we would have done differently. And I'm sure that that list is long. Again, when I think of instincts and restrictions on people's liberty, Diefenbaker would have been on the side of to the extent possible, of protecting those liberties, and
Okay.
not having government dictate what people should do.
One of Diefenbaker's most famous quotes, often used, is this one here: "I am a Canadian, free to speak without fear, free to worship in my own way, free to stand for what I think right, free to oppose what I believe wrong, or free to choose those who shall govern my country. This heritage of freedom I pledge to uphold for myself and all mankind." Is that something he lived out in his political life, do you think?
100%. I
Okay.
think not just his political life, but what he, growing up, how he related to Indigenous people, even in his youth, in his legal career. Certainly, he lived that in his political career, absolutely. So, that statement that you referred to, and it's a wonderful expression. It's,
Yeah.
it feels like it should be at the preamble to our Constitution,
Hmm.
as aspirational. Similar to the, our BNA Act begins with "whereas the provinces," unlike the Americans, which begins with "we the people." So
Hmm.
Diefenbaker would have been on the people side. But look at what he actually, more than words, he did pass the Bill of Rights in 1960, something he'd been advocating for the previous 20 years at least, when no one was talking about individual rights in
Yeah,
Canada.
yeah. I mean, now, just to clarify, this is not the 1982 Constitution that we're familiar with now, but it was the precursor to that, I guess, right?
I would call it the precursor, certainly. I don't know that you'd have the Charter of Rights and Freedoms without the Bill of Rights that Diefenbaker passed in 1960. Now, it wasn't a constitutional amendment, so it didn't have the same power and force and reach as the 1982 Constitution, but it was setting down a standard and an aspiration, and a framework on which every subsequent piece of legislation would be judged. And it was used in the courts of law, for example, when there were laws that clearly discriminated against Indigenous people. And
Hmm.
those laws were struck down because of Diefenbaker's Bill of Rights. So, and it's not just legally. Diefenbaker gave the Indigenous people the right to vote without surrendering any of their other rights.
Yeah,
He
that's fascinating. I think a lot of us going, oh yeah, boy, that's when did that happen? Who did that? That was Diefenbaker. Really interesting.
And he did it instinctively. This wasn't a response to demands, even from Indigenous people. Were not clamoring for this. And the previous Liberal
Really?
government had said,
Wow.
Yes, indigenous, because Sir John A. Macdonald had given Indigenous people the right to vote, those who lived off reserve. The subsequent liberal government took that away from them, the right to vote. And the liberal position up until Diefenbaker had been, yeah, you can have the right to vote, but you have to surrender all of your treaty and other rights. You would have the same status as any other Canadian, and all of the the agreements that have been signed become effectively null and void for you. So they weren't interested in that at all. And Diefenbaker said, you can have the right to vote, no surrender of rights whatsoever. And it's that mindset that caused him to stand up to the United Kingdom, Australia, other countries in the Commonwealth that were predominantly white, to have South Africa expelled effectively from the Commonwealth.
Wow.
So as much as Diefenbaker was a monarchist, he didn't hesitate to stand up to the British government when they were on the wrong side of history.
Yeah, he had some chutzpah, that's for sure. Hey,
but that's the vision, the purpose, and the destiny
Yep.
that I talked about, that where you went 0 for 5, this is what he wanted to fulfill.
Yeah, that's, yeah. All right, if you're just joining us here, it's a fascinating book, worth reading for sure. Again, it's called Freedom Fighter, John Diefenbaker's Battle for Canadian Liberties and Independence. It's available anywhere you buy books, Amazon, etc. And again, bobplamondon.com. Bob, let me ask you about his upbringing. He was raised in a Christian home, right? So did he take his faith seriously? Did he, did it influence any of his political decision making at all?
So, he was Baptist,
Okay.
and he would quote from Scripture. They called him the chief, but his view was, and he would use Bible quotes to say, I'm the chief, but that just means I'm the servant to all. I'm the master of none and the servant to all, which had a biblical connotation. So I would, he was church going and respectful, but I don't think he, as a politician, led with it, in the first instance, as foundational to his political decision making. Again, because he very much wanted all Canadians to be included. And you mentioned the quote, free to worship in the way I see fit. He would see himself as representing people who had different religious affiliations, any religious affiliations or no religious affiliations. But he was, I think his mother, when he was looking at career choices, his mother would have preferred him to be a preacher, to be a politician, or to be a preacher, to be a lawyer, because he had that gift of oratory. So I think it was clearly part of his life, but it wasn't something that was so foundational that it overpowered other forces and influences.
Okay. Let me ask you a little bit about, again, kind of reflecting on where we're at in today's society, a lot of the DEI movement, Diefenbaker's vision of one Canada, I guess it'd be kind of a contrasting to what we're seeing today, maybe the ethnicity pandering that we see a lot of these days. Special treatment for certain groups, that sort of thing. How would he respond to that, you think?
Well, throughout his political career, and certainly when he became prime minister and when the party was challenging his leadership, you often heard him talk about hyphenated Canadians. Mm-hmm. And he opposed any form of hyphenated Canadians, whether it referred to your ethnic origin or your language. He didn't even like it to be English Canadians, French Canadians. He thought we are all Canadians, equal in all respects. We should not distinguish. And in fact, he opposed Statistics Canada. It wasn't called Statistics Canada. I think it was the Bureau of
right. Okay.
Dominion Bureau at the time. He wanted the question in the survey, the national survey that asked for your country of origin, removed.
Wow.
He did not.
I kind of like that. I mean, let's toss those things aside. They seem to get in the way and cause us to, do this instead of let's work together as one.
And he did it with Indigenous Canadians. He's the
Okay.
first, he certainly appointed the first Indigenous senator, Gladstone,
Yeah.
which was, he appointed the first woman to cabinet, Ellen Fairclough, who,
Wow.
that was a breakthrough. He appointed the first person to cabinet who was neither of English or French origin, Michael Starr, who was Ukrainian in
Hmm.
origin. And this Michael Starr, to the people out west who had Ukrainian origin, couldn't believe that they could speak Ukrainian to a member of the Canadian cabinet. They thought they'd never see such a thing.
But I love it. He's reaching out to everyday Canadians. You're all included this. You don't have to be super rich or, certain ethnicity and that sort of thing or a certain education level. And that's maybe why people loved him so much.
You
I'm
know what he
running out
didn't
of
do,
time
Paul?
here. Sorry?
To say one thing, you know what he didn't do?
What's
He
that?
wouldn't go to any club that discriminated
Ah,
people because of their religion or the
yeah,
color of their
yeah.
skin. Again, he didn't have to think about it. He just knew what was right and wrong.
I like it. I'm running out of time. Real briefly, what would he do with Alberta separation and the movement there?
So he would do everything he could in his power to keep the country united.
Kind of thought so.
He wouldn't even he thought social credit was the whole social credit movement, which was strong in his time, was not good for Canada. He believed in national political parties that could represent every part of the region, and part of that, Paul, is because he wanted Canada to be as strong as possible, as prosperous as possible, cover as much territory as possible, so that we could resist the continental pressure of the United States and maintain our ties to the
Okay.
United Kingdom and that system of government.
I'm out of time here. I got to leave it there. We could talk about this for a lot longer, but thank you so much for making time for us, Bob. Again, I want to put a plug in for your book, worth reading. Again, you can get it at Amazon.ca. Freedom Fighter, John Diefenbaker's Battle. BobPlamondon.com as well. Tell your friends about that. Tell your friends about WizeUp, WizeUp.ca. Don't forget to hit subscribe as well.